Andrew Beckwith is the president of the Massachusetts Family Institute. He's good friends with, he leads a family policy council there, and he's done some amazing work on protecting parental rights. Massachusetts has a state version of this, Andrew. So you're a little bit out front of us. What are you seeing out there?
That's right. Thanks, Craig. Well, I'm very grateful for this event to raise awareness about the potential consequences of this Equality Act. And as you mentioned, here in Massachusetts, we've been suffering under various aspects of the Equality Act for years. For example, we have sexual orientation non-discrimination as a class in Massachusetts law, and one example of what that's done to Christian education is a few years ago there was a all-girls Catholic school founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph in Milton, Mass, that was successfully sued under this type of law, because they declined to hire a man who was in a homosexual relationship with another man and married to them. And so they were denied the opportunity to have an intentional community of faith that abided by the clear teaching of the Catholic Church because of this type of Equality Act legislation, which had been passed in Massachusetts back in 1989. Now, ironically, that version did have supposedly a religious exemption. But by the time it was finally litigated, it was found to not even cover an all-girls Catholic school founded by an order of nuns. So very concerning, and we're still only discovering some of the consequences of this type of legislation now as leftist bureaucrats and judges really push the envelope of what the law would allow them to do for this agenda. More recently, we had gender identity added to our state laws back in 2015, and almost immediately, I had to get on the phone and talk with Christiana Holcomb from ADF, who you just had on, because our state attorney general was saying that this new gender identity law would require even churches to allow adult men into the women's bathrooms. And for some churches that have gyms as part of a community outreach, that they would have to allow men into the women's locker rooms as well. Now, fortunately, with Christiana, we were able to push back on that because churches were not supposed to be covered under state law, but all kinds of other public accommodations and businesses were. We actually did a public records request to find out how are these laws being used. Supposedly there's all this terrible discrimination occurring that necessitates these laws. Let's see how they're actually being used. Who are they protecting? And what we found, for example, under the gender identity and non-discrimination laws, some of the lawsuits included a man who identified as a woman and wanted to stay overnight in a women's shelter in Boston. He was removed from there because A, he was a man, and B, he was also intoxicated. And yet this law allowed him to bring a discrimination claim against that women's shelter because they refused to let him in. Even more egregious, I think, if you can imagine it, was there is a beauty spa in Massachusetts run by women who were sued by a man who identified as female and who wanted a Brazilian bikini wax. So this is maybe sort of a family broadcast, so I'm not going to get into details to what that entails, but suffice to say it was not a treatment that these women were comfortable performing on an anatomical male. And yet he was able to bring a claim under this legislation, again, the Massachusetts version of the Equality Act. Another example that goes to athletics, I had a father reach out to me because his daughter, who had made varsity on the rowing team for her school, was very excited to participate in the Head of the Charles regatta here in Massachusetts a few years ago, but she was bumped off of her team because a male in her school decided to identify as female and bumped her off of that varsity squad. Now, in all these cases, we tried to get these individuals that we learned about or who came to us to tell their story publicly as a word of warning to the rest of the nation and as a way to push back against these laws. And all of them were terrified of speaking publicly about it because the atmosphere is so hostile. You're not allowed to object. You're not allowed to point out that transgender women are actually biological anatomical males. And so that's why I'm so grateful that you're having this event now so that people can see and understand what the consequences are.